Hello everyone, welcome to Unit 1 Part 2 where we're going to be discussing the topic of weighted voting. So this will be the primary focus of Unit 1 Part 2, and weighted voting is kind of its own thing because it is very different from the premise of all of the other voting systems that we have seen thus far. The biggest difference is that each person voting does not have the same amount of power as every other person that is voting. In all of the other voting systems that we've dealt with up to this point, every person had one vote, and one vote counted as one vote. But in the system that we're going to be seeing for Unit 1 Part 2 here, we're going to see that some people have more than one vote, and this is what makes a weighted voting system. Typical places where we see weighted voting systems employed would include like companies. So for instance, if we're trying to make a decision about a large company, some people own more shares of the company than others, so their decision carries more weight. So when they vote, they get more votes than somebody who owns a small portion of the company. Another good example is actually our presidential election. It is a weighted voting system because our president is elected by the Electoral College, and certain states have more electoral votes than other states. So a state doesn't vote as one, they vote with their electoral votes. So a state like California has a lot of electoral votes, whereas a state like Wyoming only has two. So California carries a lot more weight or a lot more power in the presidential election than the state of Wyoming would. All right. So to understand how weighted voting systems typically work, we're just going to run through some of the basics today, and then we'll build it up a little each day. Okay, we'll start with the beginnings here, just some basic vocabulary. I'm not going to read this to you guys. You guys can read that on your own if you want. I'm going to go through a problem, and as I go through the problem, I'll kind of point out some of these vocabulary words as we go through. All right, so let's look at a first example here. Let's say we have a small company. There are four shareholders. We have Mr. Smith, we have Mr. Garcia, Ms. Hughes, and Ms. Lee, and they all have a stake in the company. And let's assume, for simplicity here, that we have 100 total votes. So there's 100 total votes in this particular voting system. And we know that Mr. Smith has a 30% ownership share, right? So that means he would get 30 of the 100 votes. That would be 30%. Right? And you start to see why I chose 100 as the total number of votes here. All right, so Mr. Garcia, our next voter, he has a 25% stake in the company, so he's going to get 25 of those votes. And Mrs. Hughes, write these names down here. Mrs. Hughes is going to get 25 votes as well because she has a 25% stake. And Miss Lee gets 20 votes because she has a 20% stake. All right, and then they tell us that the company bylaws state that more than 50% of the ownership has to approve any decision. So that means that we need at least 51 votes to pass a measure or to make a decision, as they say. All right. Now, the way that they would represent a weighted voting system is with a specific kind of notation that kind of gives you a general summary of how it works in one nice, easy line. All right. So they usually start off with a bracket like this. And the very first number that you're going to write down is the number of votes that you need to make a decision. Right. So we're going to say we need at least 51 votes to pass a measure or to make a decision here. And then what you do is you list the weights of each player as they're listed here, right? So Mr. Smith would be considered player 1, and he would have 30 votes. And then player 2 would be Mr. Garcia with 25 votes. And then player 3 would be Mrs. Hughes with 25 votes. And Mrs. Lee is our fourth player with 20 votes. And when they write those weights, they write them in descending order, so the largest weight will always go first. So player 1 will always be the one that has the largest ownership stake in the company. Okay, so this number here, the number of votes that's needed to make a decision, this thing is called a quota, usually represented with a simple queue. All right, these, all right, the 30, the 25, the 25, and the 20, these are the weights. Okay. And just by looking at this, we can tell that we have 4 players, we can see what their weights are, and we understand what the quota is for this voting system. Okay, so some typical problems that you might get, they might describe a situation like this, or maybe they describe it in a different way, and your goal is to come up with a voting system using this notation to describe it. Okay, all right. All right, so in order to have meaningful weighted voting systems, we do need to place some limits on the quota. All right, so that quota, the number of votes that's needed to make a decision or pass a measure, can't be too small and it can't be too big. All right, so the limits on the quotas are as such. And again, remember, Q represents quota, and the quota has to be less than or equal to the total number of votes. Okay. And the upper end of the quota, right? How big can we make the quota? Well, the quota, I'm sorry, how small can we make the quota? The quota has to be at least 1/2 of the total votes. And we'll talk about why here, because consider this voting system where we don't know the quota, but we know the players have weights of 3, 2, and 1. Okay, so there's 6 total votes in this particular election, and let's say that we set the quota to be 3, right? So I cross out the Q and I put a 3 here, and we know that we need 3 votes to pass a measure here. And look at what happens. Player 1 has enough votes by himself to pass a measure, but so does player 2 and player 3. So player 1 here could vote yes, and player 2 and 3 here could vote no, and we would both reach quota, which doesn't lead to any decisions being made. All right, so we can't let the quota be too small. It needs to be at least half of the total votes, or greater than half of the total votes. It can't actually be half; it has to be greater than half. So we would need the quota to be at least 4 in this situation. All right. Now let's say we made the quota too big. Let's say we made the quota 7. All right. So if I made the quota 7, everyone could vote yes, and you still wouldn't be able to make a decision. All right, so those are your upper and lower ends, and it actually works out for every voting system. You just look at your total number of votes. The biggest that you can make the quota would be less than or equal to the total number of votes. All right, so it works out for every single system out there. Okay, so let's take a look here at a situation. We're going to try and develop our own voting system here in Try It Now 1. So we have a committee that has 4 representatives from the management of this company and 3 representatives from the workers' union. All right, so we want to pass proposals, and to pass a proposal, we need 4 members of this committee to support it, including at least 1 member of the union. All right, so we want to find a voting system that can represent the situation. Now, there's a lot of ways that we can set this up, and I'm going to show you 2 and explain why they work. Okay, so here's the first one I'm going to show you. I'm going to say a quota means you need 13 votes. Right, so you need 13 votes from the committee to pass a proposal. All right, and we have 4 members of the management, and I'm going to give them each 3 votes. All right, so there's my 4 members of management, and then I have 3 members of the union, and I'm going to give them each 4 votes. Okay, so there's my 7 players, 4 from management, 3 from the union, and if I look at what happens here, I need 13 votes to pass measure. So if all of the management were to get on board and say, yes, we want to pass this proposal, they would only get a total of 12 votes. So 1 person from the union would have to swing their 4 votes in their favor to pass a proposal. Same thing, if the union were to get all of their votes together, they couldn't pass a measure by themselves either. They would have to get 1 member of management to help them out. Okay? Here's another way we could do it. Right, so let's say or, and let's say I make the quota 6 this time. And let's say I don't give every member of management the same number of votes. Instead, let's do 2, 1, 1, 1. Okay. So we go 2, 1, 1, 1, and these would be my 4 management people, and then I would have my union members being 2, 1, 1. Right, so I could do something like that, and I can make these guys the union members. And it would be the same thing, right? So if I had all 4 members of management get together and say, yes, we want to pass this proposal, well, they would only have 5 votes total. So somebody from the union side of the committee would have to jump over and agree with them as well. Okay? So these would both be viable voting systems for the scenario that is described here. All right? So let's look at power. What does it mean to have power? And we're going to talk about this in depth, but for now there are essentially 3 levels of power that we need to make sure that we recognize right away when we look at these weighted voting systems, because what we don't want to do, there's definitely two of these levels in here that we don't want to see happen in our weighted voting system when we create it. And the first one is a dictator. Okay, we don't want to create any dictators where we give a single person in the voting system the power to pass a proposal by themselves. Okay, so for instance, if I were to look at this voting system right here, the quota is 10, and player 1 has 11 votes all by himself. So these 2 guys right here, there is nothing they could do to stop him from passing a measure. They're practically inconsequential. They don't matter. This guy can make all the decisions and has all of the power in this voting system. So he is what's called a dictator. All right, and we say if their weight is equal to or greater than the quota, they're a dictator because they can pass a measure all by themselves. We want to definitely avoid creating any dictators because it invalidates the entire voting system. All right. And this next one is veto power. This one's not so horrible. Sometimes you do want to have somebody that might have a veto power. In other words, they don't have the power to pass a measure or to make a decision all by themselves, but they have the power to stop a decision from being passed. Okay, so if we look at this voting system, player 1 has 6 votes. Okay, and player 2 and player 3, if they teamed up and said, yes, we want to pass a measure, they would have 5 total votes, which means they don't have enough to get to the 8. They have to have player 1 be on board if they want to pass a measure. So player 1 can decide on any measure to say no. All right. If he says yes, he still has to get one of them to agree with him, so he doesn't have dictator power, but he can stop any measure from being passed. All right. The last one, and this is definitely one that we want to avoid creating, this is the one where we create a dummy. Okay. Now, a dummy is a player that actually has no power. They have no influence in the outcome whatsoever with the way that the weighted voting system is created. Okay, so player 3 in this particular voting system is said to be a dummy because he has no influence in the outcome. The only way the quota is met is with both the support of player 1 and player 2. So let's say player 1 gets on board, right? He's got 7 votes, and player 3 gets on board. He's got 2 votes. Okay, well that's only 9, so that's not enough to pass a measure. So player 1 has to get player 2 to join up with him, right? These 2 guys have to team up if they're going to pass the measure. Even if player 2 and player 3, right? So let's say player 2 and player 3 teamed up, they could only get 8. Okay, so the only way they can pass measures if player 1 and player 2 team up and say, yes, let's make this decision. Even if all 3 of them were to team up, they really don't need player 2. Just the 2 of them would get it done. So let's take a look at our example here. All right. So you might be given a voting system, and your job is to identify whether or not there are any dictators, does anyone have veto power, and are there any dummies? Okay. So let's take a look at this one and see what we got. So let's start with dictators. Okay. Remember, dictators would have they would have enough votes for the quota all by themselves. So the quota here is 16, right? So if you need to, you can mark that with a Q. Just to remind you, that's a quota, and no one has 16 votes all by themselves. So we don't have any dictators. That is good news. So let's talk about veto, right? Does anyone have veto power? Well, let's see. So if anyone's going to have veto power, it's probably going to be this 7. There could be more than one person who has veto power, but we can instantly test and see if 7 has veto power by letting these 4 players team up and seeing if they have enough votes by themselves. Okay, so 6, 3, that's 9, 9 and 3 is 12, 12 and 2 is 14. So even if the other 4 players in this election teamed up, they would not have enough to reach quota. They would have to get player 1 on board. So player 1 has veto power. Okay, let's check and see if player 2 has veto power. Okay, so player 2 has 6 votes. Well, let's say player 1 teams up with these 3 guys right here. So that would be 7, and this would be 10, 15. So if player 1, 3, 4, and 5 were to team up, they would only get 15 votes. So that would mean that they need player 2 to get on board as well. All right, so player 2 also has veto power. Okay, so let's keep running down the line here and saying, well, what about player 3? Okay, so player 3, let's say he says no. Let's see if they need him, right? So these 2 guys could team up, that's 13, and then these 2 guys would team up for another 5, that's 18. So player 3 here does not have any veto power. He can't stop the other 4 from teaming up and reaching quota. All right, so these are the 2 with quota. All right, then we're looking for dummies. Dummies. All right, so is there anybody here who does not have any influence on the election? And I would say if anyone's going to be a dummy, it's probably going to be this 2 on the end. So and as it turns out, player 5 is a dummy. And that is because there is no coalition, or there's no way that you can create a team up of any of these players where player 5 with his 2 votes are actually essential to any of the voting outcomes.